Ciao a tutti and welcome to Venice Talks, a podcast series dedicated to Venice in Italy. I'm your host, Monica Cesarato, a Venetian food and travel blogger. Join me as I share my insider knowledge to help you explore Venice at 360 degrees. In this weekly podcast, we'll dive into the heart of a city, uncovering hidden stories and connecting with the people who make Venice unique. The artisans, the writers, the fashion designers, the bloggers, the journalists, and more. Let's break free from cliché and discover the true essence of Venice, not just the monuments, but the vibrant people, the Venetians. Experience Venice the right sustainable way. You can find me on my blog at www.monicacesarato.com and across all social media platforms. Enjoy the episode and let's journey through Venice together. Welcome back to Venice Talks, Season 4, Episode 14. Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Venice Talks. Today, my special guest is none other than the best curator for me, absolutely. I already told her at the beginning of the conversation, Gražina Subelytė from the Peggy Guggenheim in Venice. Hi Gražina, how are you?
Hello, Monica. So nice to be here. And thank you so much for such a generous introduction.
Well, first of all, where do you come from?
So
With
I'm from
such an interesting name.
I'm from Lithuania, Vilnius, the Baltic states, but I've been in Venice almost 19 years now.
Okay, I thought your Italian was perfect, but I thought, I thought maybe you were from England or something like that. Your Italian is just as good as your English, I'm going to say. You speak perfect. Okay, so can you briefly introduce yourself and tell me about your role at the Peggy Guggenheim?
Yes, so I am the curator of the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, and I work with both the permanent collection of the museum. So I curate it together with our director, Carol Bale, and I also do temporary exhibitions. Maybe some of your listeners have seen a show I did 4 years ago on Surrealism and Magic.
Yes, I loved it. Oh, it was amazing. Was that you?
Yes, that was my exhibition.
One of the best exhibitions ever. I loved it. It was amazing.
It means so much, yes, and it was deeply related to my PhD, which I did at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And I'm also the co-curator of the present exhibition, Peggy Guggenheim in London, The Making of a Collector, on which, together with my co-curator Simon Grant, I've worked for no less than 6 years.
Wow, that's a long time. Well, let's talk about the Peggy Guggenheim in general later. Let's talk about this collection that I got to say again, this new exhibition, is actually amazing. Let's start from the beginning. Who was Peggy Guggenheim when she arrived in London before becoming who she became later?
That is a great question. So I think the best way to say is that Peggy Guggenheim was someone who was very intellectually curious. She was very well socially connected, and she definitely was wealthy. She had the means to buy the art that we see today ending up in her museum in Venice. When she comes to London, that happens in late 1937, but she had already arrived in England in 1932. But
how old was she around that time?
Around that time, so she was born in 1898. So yes, would have been around 34, I would say.
Oh, young then, quite young. Okay.
Exactly, quite young. But before that, she already had some formative experiences in the creative world. For instance, she was born in New York, and already there as a young woman, she had her first experience in the creative world, working as an assistant in a bookstore called Sunwise Stern. And it's there, for instance, that she had seen the very first abstract artwork in her life, and that was a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. And later on, when she turns of adult age in the American sense, so it's 21 years of age, she goes to Paris, which is where all the American expatriates had gone back in the day. And she meets many artists and intellectuals like Marcel Duchamp, or even like Lawrence Vail, who was a Dada artist and writer, and who was to become her future husband. And so she really rubs shoulders with many people that influence and inspire her, and with whom she has many exchanges. And in the 1920s, she travels extensively in Europe. And I must also say that she visited many museums in Europe, specifically holding with her a book written by Bernard Berenson on Renaissance art. So this
Right.
was some of her earliest education in the arts.
Mm-hmm.
And then after these extensive travels in Europe, then in 1932, she goes to England. By then, she had already had her two children, Sinbad and Peggy, so she's already a mother. She had already separated from her husband, Lawrence Vale, and she had already bought a house, then buys it, in 1934 in the countryside called Yew Tree Cottage,
Right.
countryside in England on the borders of Hampshire and Sussex.
Beautiful area.
And so I think, before she, opens her gallery in London, we find Peggy Guggenheim very curious about the creative world at large, certainly about the art world as well. But I also say creative world at large because it's in that moment when she had that house in the countryside, she had received a letter from another friend called Peggy Waldman, who tells her, why don't you do something serious with your life? Either open a bookstore or an art gallery. And I have to tell you, because of what I just mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if she had opted for a bookstore instead, but she does go for an art gallery. But things could have been very different.
Well, she could have had the best bookstores in the world.
She really could have. She could have
Yeah.
had a literary agency as well. She supported so many writers and women writers as well. And I think this is yet another story to be told fully about Peggy Guggenheim.
And it's very interesting because there are very interesting times when this happenings, because it's before the Second World War. The times are strange, let's say, nonetheless. And they are, UK was in a way detached a little bit from what was happening in the rest of Europe, but still, it's interesting it's interesting as well that she picked the UK to stay, isn't it?
I think it's completely interesting. I think in her life, the United Kingdom was always very important to her. Already since she was a child, she had already visited the United Kingdom with her mother, Florette Seligman, when they had taken long trips around Europe and then had extended stays in the UK. And even her nanny, when Peggy Guggenheim was still a child, had instilled this great love in her in 19th century English literature. And she would often come back there. Many of her relatives also lived there. And back in the 30s, also her sister Hazel McKinley, who too becomes very important in this gallery story, had also lived in the UK. So yes, I think, she definitely was an Anglophile since the get-go. And many people don't even realize, that her museum that we see in Venice today would have ended up initially in the United Kingdom in London. In fact, a few years before Peggy Guggenheim died, she had said, I was in love with Venice for 50 years. Had it not been in Venice, I would have lived in the English countryside.
Right.
And
Okay. That's so interesting. Well, I remember you mentioning something like this during the press conference. So, how
yeah.
important were figures such as Marcel Duchamp in shaping her artistic vision?
Oh, they were fundamental to her. Peggy Guggenheim quite famously admitted herself that she couldn't distinguish one thing from another in the art world back then, when she was still learning. And so Marcel Duchamp was someone that really introduced her to that difference between abstraction and surrealism. And throughout her life, she came to collect and show works dedicated to both of these tendencies. Marcel Duchamp also suggested a number of artists for the exhibitions at Guggenheim Jeune, her gallery in London, and forged friendships with them, established connections with them. And at the same time, we talk about people like Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright, who was a very dear friend of Peggy Guggenheim's, and he was the one that told her, when she was already in England, that she should concentrate on contemporary art because it was a living thing. That she shouldn't be looking at the past, and I told you she read the book by Baron Berenson on Renaissance art. So he told her to abandon it all and really look at the living artists, work. Beyond men like Beckett and Marcel Duchamp, and for instance, the British art critic Herbert Reed, there are also wonderful women like Mary Reynolds, who was an American artist and bookbinder. And she also suggested some names for the gallery programming. And I think another name I really should be remiss not to mention is Win Henderson, who I think is often left in the footnotes of Peggy Guggenheim's life and kind of the story of this gallery. But Win Henderson was actually the single and sole employee of the gallery for its entire existence. She was the gallery manager. And she also lured artists into the gallery programming, so also established connections. And Peggy Guggenheim called her this kind of Titian beauty with a great capability for remembering people's faces. So she also found the gallery space and designed its entire graphic identity. So yes, kind of there's a whole entourage of people that is surrounding Peggy Guggenheim that she was smart enough, I think, wise enough to listen to. Because, back in the day, if you can understand that, to understand already then that Marcel Duchamp is really the future, and she makes him really her most important advisor. I mean, that tells you something about Peggy Guggenheim as well.
Yeah.
That she was astute enough, she was intelligent enough to know this.
Yeah.
But at the very same time, I also think she had a great intuition and acumen, and she knew exactly what art she liked and what art she didn't like. So we cannot take away that agency away from her as well. I think it was a mix of both. It's the advisors, what they told her, and combined with her own ideas.
In which area of London was she based?
She was based in Cork Street. So the gallery was based at 30 Cork Street, which to this day is still a very famous street for galleries. And it's right next to the Royal Academy in London.
Okay. Yes, I understand which area you're talking about. Okay. Now, the gallery was active only for 18 months, which is very short, okay?
Yes.
In the world of art, of course. But in that range of time, she had an incredible number of exhibitions, didn't she?
She had an incredible number indeed. It's no less than 21 projects in 18 months. When I think about it,
that's a lot.
it's a huge amount. Now we do 2 exhibitions per year, and they stay longer, about 5.5 months. So for me, 21 projects in 1.5 years seems like a really astonishing amount of exhibitions. But some of them took place simultaneously. Like she would have 2 projects happening at the same time quite often. But it also just goes on to show you what, incredibly experimental and just dynamic energy was leading this enterprise and her adventure in London, if you will. And it was an incredibly innovative space. She, as I mentioned at the get-go, she showed all these artists related to abstraction and surrealism. It must be said, mainly European artists and British artists. But among these shows, she, for instance, gave the first solo exhibition to Vasily Kandinsky in the United Kingdom, and he was already over 70 years old back then. She gave important solo exhibitions to surrealist artists like Yves Tanguy, his first solo show in England, like the Danish artist Rita Kjær Larsen. She, for instance, organized the first group collage exhibition ever in the United Kingdom, and also did the sculpture show that caused a massive scandal. So really, I mean, there was no kind of limit to her experimentation, and she showed various techniques, not just paintings, not just sculpture and drawings, but also theatrical dolls, as well as photography and ceramics, and kind of theater designs. I mean, it was really an eclectic and wonderful space, very innovative and groundbreaking for the time.
Yeah, and by the time she came to Venice, what we see in Venice really was born from this in a way, wasn't it? I mean, she literally moved it over to Venice later on, in a way.
Oh, completely. A number of the artists that we see ending up in her collection that is housed in Venice today as she wanted, actually a number of those works were already brought from her exhibitions in London. So for instance, in our exhibition here, in our temporary exhibition space, you can see paintings by artists like Piet Mondrian, but also the British artist who is associated with Surrealism, John Tunnard, Yves Tanguy, as well as sculptures by Jean Art, that she had originally bought from her own exhibitions, because in fact nobody else wanted to buy those works. People had not yet warmed up to modern art. So yes, the genesis for her collection and also for that idea of museum really comes from the London years. Completely true.
So why did you choose to focus on the London years then as an exhibition?
Of course, that's a great question. So in fact, long before I even came to work for the Guggenheim, more than 20 years ago, there was an exhibition done on art of this century, which is the gallery museum that Peggy Guggenheim had in New York in the mid-1940s. So we already did a show on that. Then in fact, in 2019, together with our director, worked on an exhibition called Peggy Guggenheim, The Last Doggeressa, which concentrated on her years and collecting in Venice. And, having done these two shows, we had always thought that her London years have remained lesser known and under-researched and really should be much better known to the public. Because I think it's precisely then in London, at the age of 39 when she opens the gallery. I mean, she's almost 40, but she's not in her 20s anymore. I think she really understood that this was going to be her responsibility for the rest of her life, to help the artists of her own time by exhibiting them, by collecting them, and giving them opportunities at the time when nobody else was willing to do this. So I think this is a moment, where Peggy Guggenheim becomes the Peggy Guggenheim that we know of her, that legendary patron and collector, that we know of her as today. Those very first steps she's taken in the art world. And of course, as I mentioned, this was an experimental period, so she's really trying things out, but also being so bold and so courageous. And then, this marks the rest of her life. And so we really thought this moment should be told to the public, that those who don't know, they should know it. And I also couldn't be more pleased that this exhibition after Venice will then travel, in fact, to London, to the Royal Academy there, and will also later go to the Guggenheim in New York.
Amazing.
So for the very first time, connecting these three cities that was so important to Peggy Guggenheim.
How much of the artwork did you have to get from outside of the Guggenheim Venice, borrowing and stuff, or was mainly stuff that you already, in the archives?
So about 15 works in the exhibition are from our permanent collection, and we have about 85 other loans. So a number of other works, but it's also because, together with my co-curator, Simon Grant, we went, on like a scavenger hunt. We basically, we went to look for the art, that she had exhibited in the gallery and tried to find those pieces that were originally showed her. And this is the reason why it took us so many years of research.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I assume most of the stuff was also owned by private people because it would have been bought, I assume, right?
Absolutely. Many private collections, and some works ended up in public collections. For instance, there's one Tanguy painting that is in the National Galleries of Scotland. And also very famously, Peggy Guggenheim with her sister gave a Kandinsky to the Tate, so we're very lucky to have it here. But yes, many private collectors, and we were so thrilled that they all jumped on board and immediately wanted to support the show.
Oh, that is so interesting. Also because most of his artwork, obviously if it's owned privately, doesn't get to be seen generally by the general public. So, it was, we're talking about 80, 90 years have been out of, of the public eye. So amazing, beautiful. Listen, back now instead to the permanent collection, to work in the museum full time and so on. Did any letter, photograph, or archival documents change your understanding of her from when you started working on on her art?
Yes, so when it comes to the archive, we're very lucky here in Venice to have these fantastic 15 scrapbooks that Peggy Guggenheim kept in her lifetime. And these essentially are notebooks on which she glued various press clippings about various periods of her life. And there's one particular scrapbook which we're also exhibiting in the very first room of the exhibition, in which she glued all possible press clippings, so everything that the media was writing about her exhibitions at the Guggenheim Jeune Gallery. And it is the first time that we properly studied that book. We read all of the press reviews, both positive and negative. And I have to tell you, for me, it was very interesting to see, some critics were writing positive reviews, but there was so much negative press being written about the exhibitions that she did. Even Vasily Kandinsky, whom like today we recognize as, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, if you will. Even then, many critics, like one of them from the Times newspaper wrote that Kandinsky's art, creates some difficulty for the viewer. And so it's quite interesting to see their responses. And so what it made me understand even more, I think, about Peggy Guggenheim's character is just really how courageous she was, and that she really understood, that even bad press was good press. This was necessary press because people were writing about those shows, you
Yeah,
know,
of course.
and that only years later they would have understood the meaning of those exhibitions. I think, you know, this is when it comes to archival material, but there are a couple of other different phrases about told by Peggy Guggenheim that I think reread also and understood even much more when preparing this exhibition. You know, for instance, later in the 1960s in her life, when describing this period in London, she had said that you know, nobody was, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that nobody was willing to buy the works by the artist that she was showing, and that wanting to help them, she's starting to buy works for her collection. And now
Right.
I quote, she said, "Thus, without knowing it, I started my collection." And that tells me something about her, that she's really helping the artist from an empathetic point of view. She's
Yes,
not looking at art as an investment, you know, which
exactly.
quite often is the case today. You know, no,
Of
she knows
course.
that this is her duty. You have to have empathy towards them. And I think this is one of the most important traits of a real patron of the arts. And
Mm,
that is who she was. Or, you know, I'll give you another example. One of the galleries in our exhibition is dedicated to this Welsh-born artist, Cedric Morris. And so, for instance, in the beginning, in Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, he wanted to show these landscapes of flowers that he painted, which is she wanted to see them in the gallery. But in fact, Cedric Morris himself had a very different idea. He preferred to show these portraits of his artist friends and celebrities. And you know, even if Peggy Guggenheim wanted something different, she listened to him. So she listened to her artist, you know, and she really wanted to
mm.
kind of, you know, be their best ally. So I think, yes, this exhibition was, and preparation for it was revelatory in so many ways.
You were mentioning before that she was supporting also a lot of women artists, which
Oh,
we're looking in, in 2026 is kind of, well, isn't it obvious? But, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, to be a woman in the art world like she was, to
oh,
support women was something really new, wasn't it?
it was major. It was major. You know, even Peggy Guggenheim herself, she was so criticized for everything that she did. And I think part of the reason was also she was a woman, you know.
Mm,
They just thought, you have this, wealthy American collector coming, but she really took it all so seriously. So, we're trying to bring back, that seriousness in a sense. And she helped so many of the women. For instance, the very first surrealist exhibition she ever organized in her life, and that was at Guggenheim Jeune, was a show dedicated to Rita Kjær Larsen, this Danish surrealist artist. So
mhm.
again, she doesn't pick René Magritte or Max Ernst, one of the big names we know of as today and that we have in our collection. No, she picks Rita Kjær Larsen, and in our show we reunited three paintings by her. And so, she, for instance, was Fernand Léger's best student, and Fernand Léger would also sometimes give her small sketches of her works that he would ask her to transfer into paintings of big dimensions. So there are paintings that were fully made by Kjær Larsen that are signed by Fernand Léger. This is how underappreciated women were.
Mm,
But yes, so Peggy Guggenheim showed her surrealist paintings in the gallery. Beyond that, she also gave a show to Mary Vasiliev, who was a
mhm.
Russian-born artist, and who I think is a very fascinating figure because she didn't just do, painting, sculpture or drawings. She also developed this hybrid interdisciplinary practice that blur the boundaries between art, craft, and design. So in Peggy's gallery, she also showed these wonderful portrait dolls and puppets that she made by hand
Yes,
from
yes.
very innovative
She's
materials.
in
Yeah.
she's in the temporary exhibition, isn't she? Because I remember this particular artwork. I thought, oh, this is strange. I find it. Oh, this is different.
Exactly. It was the third room we have. And so
Yeah.
we brought together some of her dolls that she made almost 100 years ago for French
Wow.
experimental theater troops. And, those dolls kind of were made with very innovative materials. So not just, cardboard or iron wire or fabric, but also plastic. So
Mhm.
celluloid, which back in the 1920s was a very innovative material.
And it must have also been expensive as well. I'm
Yes, yes,
thinking
I believe so, exactly.
in those
But
days.
what's really also interesting is that those particular dolls, they're also quite androgynous. You don't
Mm,
quite know if you're looking at a man or a woman.
mm-hmm.
And in fact, Mari Vasiliev, the artist, also considered herself androgynous. And so I
Right.
think all these issues we talk about today, whether it's gender identity, studies or kind of interdisciplinary art, all that also comes to the fore in exhibitions like this of Mari Vasiliev. And I have to tell you, it was very difficult to find those dolls that we have in our exhibition because so many of her puppets have been destroyed over the years. They're
Oh,
very fragile. So we're
yeah, yeah.
particularly lucky to have those ones from a private collection in the show. And maybe to give a final example, the last project in the gallery was dedicated to Giselle Freund, who was a German
Mm-hmm.
photographer and activist. And Peggy Guggenheim showed her color portraits of artists and celebrities like Marcel Duchamp and Jean Cocteau and others on as a rotating slideshow in the gallery, which was the final evening. And, it marked the closure of the gallery. And actually, following that projection, this became Giselle Freund's favorite way to show her photography. So,
Mm-hmm.
really important things. And yeah, these are just some of the examples of her
Yeah,
support
yeah.
of women. Yeah.
Now I'm gonna ask you a stupid question
No
because I'm gonna
stupid
ask. No,
questions.
no, it's a stupid question because I know it's a stupid question, but and that shows how ignorant I am. But
No.
did Peggy ever paint?
How interesting. I haven't come across that.
Okay, I
Uh,
was because it's interesting because somebody that was
yeah.
understood, eventually, by study, by surrounded by herself with artists, totally understood art.
Mhm.
It would have been, interesting to know if she's ever painted or a sculpture or
Mhm.
any kind of media, art media.
It's an excellent question. I haven't come across information like that. But for instance,
Ah,
her sister Hazel McKinley, who also lived in the United Kingdom then, she was a painter. She
mm,
was an artist. And in fact, for instance, we find works that Peggy Guggenheim and her sister donated, not just to the Tate, in London, but also a
hmm.
number of regional museums in the United Kingdom. And among those donations, sometimes we would find an occasional painting by Hazel McKinley, the sister of Peggy Guggenheim. So perhaps,
Right.
that's the best answer I can give you, but it would be very
Ah,
interesting to ponder. Yes.
yeah. So sorry, I know it's a bit
No,
silly,
it's a
but
great
I
question.
just, yeah, you just wonder sometimes. So, personally, what's your favorite work of art inside all of the museum?
Inside the exhibition, you mean, or in our permanent collection
Okay,
as
let's say
well?
the exhibition because I know you work hard for it, and also let's say the permanent collection.
Well, when it comes to the permanent collection, when I was still an intern, almost 19 years ago now here at the Guggenheim, I fell in love with the Red Tower by Giorgio de Chirico. It's a
Mm-hmm.
painting from 1913, and it's a painting on which I used to do my intern talk, so presenting it to the public, and I wrote about it. So it's a work I absolutely admire, I think, because it seems so simple, but at the end, it's one of the most profound works, I think, in the collection, as all of them are.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I love the entire collection, but it just to say it's the first work I fell in love with. And when it comes to the exhibition, I think, again, just like with the permanent collection, I think all of them are key. But perhaps I could mention one specific example. It's Wolfgang Pahlen, the Austrian-born artist,
Mm-hmm.
because he begins and he ends the show. So Wolfgang
Mm-hmm.
Pahlen did this wonderful umbrella covered with sponges,
Mm-hmm.
and we hung it in the corner of the very entrance of the exhibition, kind of in the introductory room. So it's literally an umbrella covered with sponges that he called the Articulated Cloud. It's from 1937, and we're showing a replica in our exhibition because the original is so fragile it could never travel. But it is a work in which he takes a very simple, mundane, everyday object like an umbrella and
Mm-hmm.
covers it with sponge, so renders it very surreal, kind of uncanny. And you think an umbrella is supposed to protect us from the rain, but this one with the sponge, covering it, it absorbs it. So in a
Mm-hmm.
way, if you hold it above your head, it kind of heavily lands on your shoulders because the
Mm-hmm.
sponge absorbs all the water. And it becomes a perfect metaphor, almost for the socio-political climate back then.
Yeah, of
Because,
course.
kind of it so heavily lands on your shoulders, as you very rightly mentioned earlier during the podcast, that it was difficult times. World War
Yeah.
II is about to start. And, part of the reason why Peggy Guggenheim, also left the United Kingdom was the war, of course. And so I think a number of the works in the show, but particularly this umbrella, become almost, symbols and metaphors for everything that's going on back then, even if at first glance it just seems this kind of quirky Dadaist object.
Mm.
But there's much more. Yeah, it's like I think we have to look beyond appearances. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sometimes when we walk into a museum like the Peggy Guggenheim, we forget that what we see, the contemporary art we see, the modern art we see, abstract surrealism, whatever it is, we kind of take it for granted because it's been part of our life,
Yes.
Even if you're as old as I am, more or less, when instead 100 years ago that kind of art was like a whoa. It's like I think the first time people start showing naked people on films more or less. And
Exactly.
now is oh, okay, we see them all the time. It's nothing, nothing major. But I think it's a kind of reaction, like maybe Tango in Paris said, the film had the big it was a big thing about it. I think it's a kind of thing. So I think it's very important to understand the background as well. Sometimes I think the problem when we walk into these kind of museums is people just walk, look, and walk out and don't understand everything that is behind. And they should come prepared, I think, or they should always take a tour like, is I think it's one of the greatest things that you do have at Guggenheim, that you always have guided tours. I think it's a great thing that, your museum does.
Oh, absolutely. And we have wonderful guides. I think, well, it's very kind of you to say so, but I couldn't agree with you more that, these artworks we're looking at, now they seem that they're, part of our history, and they're these established artworks and we know about them. But actually, back when they were created, they were completely revolutionary and completely shocking to the people. And so this tells you that also what Peggy Guggenheim did was so very revolutionary. And, for instance, that umbrella that I mentioned to you by Wolfgang Paalen, the critics called it Jabberwocky, and they used kind of really curious words, to describe the art that I couldn't quite understand, because it wasn't traditional. How could you just take and everyday object you see around you, and then, just make it into an artwork? I mean, there's, all of this starts with Marcel Duchamp, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But completely, it was so shocking to people. And I think one important part of our mission here in this museum is really to make sure that the public doesn't forget that revolutionary spirit, that, they're constantly reminding that what we're looking at sets the stage for everything that is to come into the future. And so there's continuity in our history, deep continuity.
Do you think also what a big influence was given also by having the Biennale here in Venice for her,
For
and
Peggy
being
Guggenheim.
in
Yes.
contact with the people of
I am so glad you asked this. Absolutely. For instance, the very first time she ever showed her collection in Europe was at the Venice Biennale in 1948. And that was the first post-war Biennale, because the Biennale closed because of World War II for 6 years. And at that time, Peggy Guggenheim was in New York, running her second gallery, Art of the Century, there. And then she got the invitation from the Biennale to show her collection in the Greek pavilion, because the Greeks were still at civil war. And this really became the very first time that she showed her collection in Europe, and some people didn't even know how to react to it. I did a small show around it in 2018, and in parallel, it's interesting to see how people were writing about her gallery in London, right? How many reviewers didn't understand what she was doing. And also I looked at the Biennale archives and looked at what the journalists were writing about the presentation of her collection in the 1948 Venice Biennale. And in that case as well, so many of the reviewers didn't even know what to make out of the art that we're looking at. So it's very curious. But yes, so she showed her collection there, but also over the years afterwards, she also bought a number of works from the Biennale. So it was very important for her. She always went to see the shows and got influenced by that connection is fundamental.
And she had a strong relation also with Venetian painters, with the groups, because she used to go and eat in the trattoria at the back of St. Mark's and so on. So she had this strong, I know because I know the owners of the trattoria.
L'Angelo, yes, of
Yes,
course.
exactly. A strong history there. So after curating the exhibition and after being working for so long at the Guggenheim, from the beginning, how has your view of Peggy changed?
So maybe I would say that it hasn't really changed, but ever more I started having so much more, even more respect for her, for that incredibly bold, adventurous spirit with which she approached everything. And it's always, as I mentioned at the get-go, I think still so much harder for women, unfortunately. But kind of sometimes knowing that even if people didn't understand immediately what she was doing, that it was the right thing to do. Even if maybe that gratification wouldn't arrive immediately, kind of a recognition that everybody understood what she was doing. I think it made me understand even much more, than I had perhaps known at the very beginning when I started working here, just how really courageous she was, and how unshakable she was also in her beliefs and what a strong woman she was, but also how curious she was and how willing to learn she was. I think this is characteristics that all of us should have for the rest of our lives, to just be curious, to want to know more, to understand more. And this is certainly who she was. And as I mentioned, also smart enough to know, which advisors to surround herself with. So for me, this was, certainly something that even more confirmed, my belief in the incredible patron of the arts, collector that she is. And I only hope that we can do justice to such an incredible woman and her story in our museum, and only you, the visitors, can tell us if we really, can do justice to her.
Oh, you do, because all of your exhibitions, and now that I know is actually you that curated even the one before, because I didn't realize it was you. I'm even more like, oh my God, because, you do an amazing job. So this temporary exhibition at the moment, until when it's on?
It's on until mid-October. I think it's the 19th of October, and then just going to the Royal Academy in mid-November, opening on the 21st of November. And then in April, mid-April 2027, it's going to open at the Guggenheim, New York.
Okay. In the meantime, I'm pretty sure you cannot tell me the details, but I'm pretty sure you're working on the new exhibition that will start next year, probably, I assume.
Yes, I'm working on 3 exhibitions, actually.
3?
Never work. Yeah. I think, it's also such a great pleasure, I think, for me and any other curator. I mean, it's a joy of our life to research and work with the artist works. But yes, I'm working on a show for fall 2027, more a collections-based show, and then for summer 2028 as well. So then that will be presented during the next Visual Art Biennale, and also for exhibitions for like 2030. But you'll get to know much more about them very, very soon.
Yeah, and I hope my podcast is still running by then. Lisa, one last question.
Yes.
How much artwork does the Guggenheim actually have in the archives altogether?
So here in Venice, so Peggy Guggenheim's collection is actually not so big. It's about 320, 30 artworks. And I say it's not so big because if you compare to Guggenheim New York, where they have thousands of objects, it's much smaller, but at least half of that collection are really some of the greatest heavy hitters, some of the most important works, of 20th century European and North American art.
Yeah.
But this is Peggy Guggenheim's collection, and then we acquired around 200 works after she had passed away.
Right.
But in her palazzo, we mainly show her collection, and then a bequest from the Schulhoff collection in the Barchesa.
Oh, and by the way, if for the people listening, if you've never been to the Peggy Guggenheim, apart from being an amazing museum, gallery, whatever, I can't call him a museum because you're not really in a museum, because you're more than that, because it's a house really.
It's a home museum.
It's
yes,
a home museum. You got a fantastic cafe, I got to say, really nice with a lovely garden as well. And the terrace upstairs is only available for events, or sometimes is also available for guests if they want to go upstairs.
So the terrace is unfortunately closed to the public for security reasons, because I mean these days we have very strict security measures.
Yeah, well,
but people are very welcome, to book events there. In those cases, proper security provisions are provided.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yes, it's a magnificent space, and the view is unparalleled.
I know. I was so glad that you did the press conference up there, and the weather was fantastic. It was like, oh, amazing. It was my first time up there, so I was very pleased. I was very impressed with that. Well, Gražina, what can I say? Wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for telling so much about, I learned so much about Peggy Guggenheim. For me, she's my inspiration from the point of view of looks, because I have glasses like her. I love glasses like her. So for me, it's like, she's my icon, as in a kind of person that wasn't afraid to be who she was. Okay. And I aspire to be that kind of person. But you gave me so much insight of who she really, 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 really was. Thank you so much.
Monica, it's I who should be thanking you. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation to be part of your podcast. It really is not just a pleasure, but such an honor to speak to you and to hear of your wonderful enthusiasm and already how much you know about Peggy Guggenheim. So thank you so much for all the love you expressed towards the museum, and I very much look forward to sharing good future projects with you as well.
Thank you so much. Speak to you soon. Ciao, ciao.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Gražina, for the wonderful insight into the new exhibition at the Peggy Guggenheim. Peggy Guggenheim in London, the maker of a collector. You can find all information on www.guggenheim-venice.it. Thank you again for listening. Venice Talks podcast is a production of Sentire Media, created, produced and hosted by me, Monica Cesarato. Follow Venice Talks wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to book a food tour or a cooking experience with me, you can find me over at www.monicacesarato.com and on all social medias with the handle @monicacesarato, where you can follow my adventures around Venice. And don't forget, if you love this episode, please rate it and leave a review. It's very much appreciated.